We are delighted to have Yamiche Alcindor here. She'll get a proper introduction from Associate Dean Kiki Edozie in a moment, but I just wanted to welcome everybody to the conversation today. And I will say what Yamiche Alcindor does is very similar to what we do here at the McCormack Graduate School, which is search for truth. And I only hope that we as faculty, students, and staff at McCormack approach our search for truth with the courage and iron will and determination and brilliance that Yamiche does. I've just been struck when I see her having conversations with our president, the strength of which that she brings to the conversation and her determination to uncover the realities that, that we need to make this world a better place. And this is a perfect opportunity to hear from a journalist who leads the charge in trying to understand how the world works and trying to uncover truth. So it's a total pleasure to welcome you all to this conversation today. And so thank you very, very much for being here. And Yamiche, thank you so much for joining us today. With that, we were not able to get our new Chancellor, Chancellor Marcelo Suarez Orozco, to be here in person, but he has a video welcome. And after that, we will hear from Associate Dean Kiki Edozie. So, Rochelle, let's hear from the Chancellor.
It is my great pleasure to welcome you all to the McCormack Graduate School's Robert C. Wood Lecture, which for 22 years has brought leading scholars and practitioners to the University of Massachusetts, Boston. Most often, the Robert C. Wood Visiting Professor has been both distinguished scholar and a high-achieving practitioner. There is no better example than Wood himself. President of the University of Massachusetts system from 1970 to 1977, Secretary of Housing and Urban Development in the Lyndon Johnson administration, Director of the Joint Center for Urban Studies at MIT and Harvard, Head of the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority, and Superintendent of the Boston Public Schools. At the same time, he wrote half a dozen books on subjects ranging. Oh, we got to start over again. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Sorry. All right. I'm feeling good now. I think this is it.
All right. Chancellor's message for Robert Wood Lecture. Take two in 3, 2.
It is my great pleasure to welcome you all to the McCormack Graduate School's Robert C. Wood Lecture, which for 22 years has brought leading scholars and practitioners to UMass Boston. Most often, the Wood Visiting Professor has been both a distinguished scholar and a high-achieving practitioner. There is no better example than Wood himself, President of the University of Massachusetts system from 1970 to 1977, Secretary of Housing and Urban Development in the Johnson administration, Director of the Joint Center for Urban Studies at MIT and Harvard, Head of the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority, and Superintendent of the Boston Public Schools. At the same time, he wrote half a dozen books on subjects ranging from urban sprawl to the presidency. Wood died in 2005, the professorship created in 1998, one of the signature annual events of the John W. McCormack Graduate School of Policy and Global Studies, carries forward what Wood's private widow, Peggy, calls Bob's very strong desire to interest students in public service. Recent Wood professors fit that mold. They include the renowned sociologist William Julius Wilson, UT Austin scholar and national commentator Peniel Joseph, U.S. Senator Maggie Hasan of New Hampshire, Robert Wood's daughter, and former Ambassador Reuben Brigidi, now President and Vice Chancellor of the University of the South in Sewanee, Tennessee, and Costa Rican diplomat Cristiana Figueres, architect of the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement. To this truly extraordinary list, we are delighted to add, as the fall 2020 Robert Wood Professor, Yamiche Alcindor, whom millions across the country, including myself, know as the White House correspondent for the PBS NewsHour. Perhaps never in our nation's history has there been a time when the pursuit of truth has been more important and more in jeopardy than it is today. Yamiche Alcindor has taken on that great challenge, often in a hostile environment, with exceptional focus, grace, and professionalism. I'm eager to hear her remarks.
Associate Dean Kiki Adozi.
Well, welcome, Yamiche Alcindor. I'm so excited to actually be in your presence, virtually at least, because every day on MSNBC, I watch you give us some Yamiche moments. And this is a loose term that Yamiche's colleagues use to describe moments when Yamiche Alcindor excels as the White House correspondent for the PBS NewsHour. One example, for example, was a favorite Yamiche moment that her colleagues say was a scoop. Alcindor reported in September 2019 that Gregory Cheadle, a Black man President Trump described as my African American. Yamiche concluded that this man had grown so frustrated with the president's rhetoric that he was leaving the Republican Party to run for a congressional seat as an independent in 2020. So hopefully we can have a Yamiche moment in your talk today. I'm really honored to introduce this fall's Robert C. Wood Visiting Professor of Public and Urban Affairs, Yamiche Alcindor. She's a White House correspondent for the PBS NewsHour show, a role that she began in January 2018. She often tells stories about the intersection of race and politics, as well as fatal police encounters. Alcindor is also a contributor for NBC News and MSNBC, often appearing on a number of shows, including Morning Joe, saw you this morning, Andrea Mitchell Reports, the Rachel Maddow Show, and Meet the Press with Chuck Todd. Previously, Yamiche worked as a national political reporter for the New York Times, where she covered the presidential campaigns of Mr. Trump and Senator Bernie Sanders, as well as congressional seats. She's also written about the impact of President Donald Trump's policies on working class people and people of color. Before joining the Times, she was a national breaking news reporter for USA Today and traveled across the country to cover stories including the school shooting in Newton, Connecticut, the death of Trayvon Martin in Sanford, Florida, and the police-related protests in Ferguson and Baltimore. Alcindor's overall goal is to be a civil rights journalist, she says, and she has inspired by the PBS NewsHour anchor Gwen Ifill, may her soul rest in power. In 2020, the White House Correspondents Association named Alcindor the recipient of the Aldo Beckman for overall excellence in White House coverage. She was also honored as the Eiffel Next Generation Award by Simmons University, right here in Boston, and Next Gen Leader Award by the Georgetown Entertainment and Media Alliance. In 2017, I have to say all these things, these great accomplishments. In 2017, Alcindor won an award in a tribute to IFIL during a Syracuse University Toner Prize ceremony. She's also a member of the National Association of Black Journalists and was named the organization's Emerging Journalist of the Year in 2013. Well, now she's made it. Alcindor, let me just finally conclude that Alcindor earned a master's degree in broadcast news and documentary filmmaking from New York University, and a bachelor's in English, government, and African American studies from Georgetown University. And she's a native of Florida, Miami, Florida, and is married to a fellow journalist and is the daughter of Haitian immigrants who met while attending college right here in Boston College. So today's talk is titled Reporting Truth Amid a Pandemic and Racial Reckoning. So please join me in welcoming journalist Yamiche Alcindor to give our full lecture, award lecture. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction. I really, really appreciate it. And thank you so much for inviting me to address you as the Robert C. Wood visiting professor at UMass Boston. As you just mentioned, my parents met while attending Boston College. My mom went to UMass Amherst as an undergrad. So I'm so excited to speak before you, while also in some ways, I should say, avoiding the coldness that is Boston. So I am sad that I can't be with you in person, while also feeling honored to be able to deliver this address. I'm honored to come before you knowing the great legacy of Secretary Wood, and the legacy they left as the former Secretary of Housing and Urban Development and the past president of the University of Massachusetts. He was a great political scientist, as well as an academic and government administrator and author. I can't imagine all that he would have been saying during these intense times. Let me start by saying the obvious. 2020 has been awful, globally, nationally, personally. The coronavirus is infecting people daily across the world and the United States. More than 6.5 million Americans have been infected. More than 194,000 Americans have died. Wildfires are devastating communities and killing Americans on the West Coast, on the East Coast, and the Gulf Coast. American citizens are facing a barrage of hurricanes. And then there's structural and institutional racism that for generations has ravaged Black people and people of color in this nation, leaving them more susceptible to dying of COVID-19. The virus in particular has exposed longtime inequalities and hit Black, Latino, and communities of color the hardest, ravaging already vulnerable populations. And we had to all witness and all bear witness to the death of George Floyd at the hand of a white police officer who kneeled on his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. We also, of course, heard of the cases of Breonna Taylor, whose family just today is going to be announcing a settlement with the city of Louisville, Kentucky, even though the officers involved in her killing have not been charged or arrested. We also heard of the cases of Ahmaud Arbery, of so many others being killed in such terrible ways on camera. The nation is now, of course, going through a national reckoning on race. And when we figure what is next, and when we figure about how we move forward, we also have to acknowledge what is happening now. Black people are some 2.5 to 3 times more likely to be killed by the police than white people. The fact of countless videos of people dying at the hands of police and vigilantes have forced Americans and motivated Americans to take to the streets in all 50 states to demand change. But it's not clear when and what kind of change, if any, may happen. African Americans, who we know are struggling, are demanding equal treatment under the law and equal human rights. People of color across the country, including Latinos and other communities, are continually pointing out that in much of America, they are treated as second-class citizens. And of course, the big issue that's happening in 2020, the election. The election is looming, and that no matter what the outcome, we all know that it will leave Americans, millions of them, feeling like they are living in an increasingly dangerous country. Yet despite all that we've endured in 2020, this year has also led to some of the most consequential and important conversations in a generation. What does it mean to truly be an American? Does the country really want to live up to the promises it makes to treat each man and woman equally? Will a pandemic, tearing through families and upending life as we know it, pull Americans even further apart, or bring us together eventually for our shared interests of survival? What does it mean that so many are looking at this election as life and death and through the lens of fear? And how do folks, and especially a Haitian American Black woman reporting at the White House like myself, stay lifted and focused on doing the work of exposing the injustices of America and pushing forward with resolve and personal joy? For me, it's about finding my purpose and being resolved in doing your life's mission. Martin Luther King put it this way: the ultimate measure of a man is not where he, or I will say she, stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he or she stands, I'll say, at times of challenge and controversy. We are truly living in times of challenge and controversy. People often pose two questions to me these days. First, why did you become a journalist in the first place? And second, how do you stay focused when you're questioning the precedent and facing pointed, targeted responses? To answer to both of those questions come down to the late Congressman John Lewis and what he called good trouble. Journalism, I should tell you, is my good trouble. In these times, as Robert Wood found his good trouble, I would say that we should all find our good trouble. Said differently, journalism is my calling, much like Secretary Wood found politics and leadership as his calling. It's how I decided to chip away at the small and larger injustices still faced by people all over the country simply because they were born and discriminated against because they were Black, Latino, queer, a woman, a white man from a rural area. Now, my entrance into my calling really comes down to a Kanye West song. And bear with me, this is old Kanye West. Kanye rapped about a young boy named Emmett Lewis Till. And as a 16-year-old in AP US history, I had no idea who he was, but I quickly learned. Bruised and beaten and murdered, Emmett's body was found at the bottom of a bayou in Mississippi in 1955. He was a 14-year-old Black boy from Chicago who was killed because a white woman claimed he had tried to flirt with her. She later recanted decades after his murder. Emmett ended up being a catalyst for the 20th century. John Lewis wrote in his last column before his death that Emmett Till was his George Floyd. He was one of the youngest martyrs in the fight for equality. A Google search for the first time showed me his maimed face. And suddenly I knew what I wanted to be. I wanted to be a woman snapping a photo of Emmett's casket. I wanted to be the reporter asking his mother, Mamie Till, why she chose to share her suffering. I wanted to be a journalist bringing America the hard truths of the ugly parts of our country. Emmett's disfigured face and the courage of his mother and the journalists who carried his story, Black journalists who put his face on the front cover of Jet magazine, they asked me to be a professional witness and I complied. 8 years to the date after Till's murder, some 250,000 people gathered in Washington for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. At that speech, Dr. King said this: "The Negro is still not free. The life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. The Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity." Those words are largely still true today, and they apply to so many Americans, including, of course, African Americans, but also Americans of all colors and stripes who are locked out of the economic prosperity of America. And segregation, I should say, was one of my first topics as a reporter, and it's really my entrance and the window through which I do my reporting on the White House, this pandemic, and 2020 as a whole. I started my career, as many journalists do, reporting on my hometown. My first byline came as an intern for the West Side Gazette, an African-American community newspaper in South Florida. At the time, I wasn't an enterprising journalist looking at social justice issues, or a White House correspondent tangling with a president. Instead, I was a confused 17-year-old who had spent the first years of my life visiting the inner cities of Miami with my social worker mother, a lifelong educator who spent 3 decades going into people's homes, asking what she could do to help. I went with her often on Take Your Child to Work Day. And as a background, my grandfather was a driven notary in a town in Haiti called Saint-Louis-du-Nord, St. Louis of the North, or North St. Louis. My grandmother was a seamstress with a big personality and a huge sense of curiosity. And my mother and my grandmother came here in 1974. My grandmother in particular was 62 years old when she left everything behind because my family decided America, with its dreams and its opportunities, offered a legacy and an opportunity where the next generation of my family should be. So my purpose, my core, my White House reporting, it comes from people loving me before I even had a name. And even more, the foundation of who I am is of immigrants who believed America when it said, give me your tired, your poor, your huttered masses yearning to be free. My mother, a fiercely independent woman, hungry to learn, came to America soon after my grandmother on June 30th, 1974. She arrived in Boston, where most of you are. She was 22 years old. She now has a PhD and is a living example of what all of us can achieve when we set out to do excellent things, and when the manacles and the flaws of America don't get in the way. I watched my mom with her PhDs be humble and compassionate and ask questions of people's lives. And soon enough, I had my own questions. I thought they were simple questions, but they were questions I have now spent more than a decade trying to answer. I asked as a young child, why in my majority Black high school was my AP chemistry class made up of almost all white students? Why did I have to be bused from the suburbs into an urban setting to go to a magnet school? Why did some of my dearest friends who were not in those coveted AP classes watch me fill out applications to go to college but not fill them out themselves? And who in the world was in charge of making all of these decisions? Simple questions, questions that I've spent my entire career trying to answer, questions that are tied so much to what we're experiencing this year. By the time I got to college and I sat where you are sitting today, I was determined to be a reporter. Now, I did lead my parents, I should say, onto saying that I was going to be a lawyer eventually. They were both Boston College grads, and they were pushing me to go to Boston College Law. But I learned and experienced journalism, and I was hooked. I talked so much about wanting to be a journalist that my hairdresser ended up talking to one of the people who became my mentors, a woman named Athalia Knight. She was amazing and a supportive reporter and who had a long career at the Washington Post. She was also someone who was best friends with Gwen Ifill, who also happened to go to the same hairdresser as me. The late journalist who, along with, of course, Judy Woodruff, the current anchor of PBS NewsHour, together with Gwen Ifill, were the first female co-anchors of a national TV news program. My first memory of Gwen is us sitting in a hairdresser at the hairdresser, me under the dryer, and her encouraging me to pursue my dreams. And I was super nervous when I met her a second time during the national convention for the National Association of Black Journalists. I walked up to her and I said, "Hi, I'm Yamiche, but you can call me Miche," sensing that my name is often a hard thing for people to say. Her response, "Don't let people nickname you." It's now been almost 4 years or longer since her death, and I think more and more about that advice every day. I think of her words about finding your moral compass and sticking to that, of knowing who you are, why you're doing what you're doing, and making people learn how to say your name, how to understand your passion with respect. In 2009, before I just graduated, I was feeling calls from my dad in Haiti, who was dumbfounded that I was not going to law school. Now, these calls, of course, cost a lot of money, but he was calling me over and over again because he was worried about my future. But I knew that my future was journalism. And I ended up having a career chronicling people's lives up close, writing about the flaws of America and the complications accompanied with our founding ideals. I often say the things that make me cry have also been amazing stories. In the summer of 2009, I interned at the Washington Post, and I wrote my first healthcare stories. Of course, we're now facing a healthcare election. And one of my first stories was about a woman who had been going to the ER for primary care for 20 years. So many Americans, as we face a pandemic, have also been relying on a healthcare system that is simply not doing enough to help people. After interning, I worked at Newsday in Long Island, and I chronicled the case of a young man who killed his best friend's girlfriends, and himself. After digging, I learned that the killer had just been released from prison and dropped into a predominantly African-American community in Long Island without much access to mental health care or medicine, and the medicine that he'd been taking in jail. He snapped, and 3 people died in part because the system failed to help him cope. Now, as we've chronicled the pandemic, the outbreaks in prison, I realized that the first stories that I told as a young journalist are still the stories that need to be told now. In 2011, I joined the staff of USA Today, and I worked on a story about a young sex trafficking victim. Her name was Asia Graves, and she looked straight ahead as she calmly told me about the night that a man paid $200 on a Boston street to have sex with her. Often, the stories that are heartbreaking, the stories that need to be told, are right before our eyes, right before our streets, right in Boston. I went on to write about the death of Trayvon Martin and what it means that Black people are often criminalized just for walking down the street or taken advantage of, like Asia was on a Boston street corner. I wrote about the lack of resources in inner cities, an unfair criminal justice system, and people tired of suppression that gave this country the protests that were Ferguson and Baltimore, and ultimately all around this country this summer. Many in the country were surprised by the scenes of militarized police, clouds of tear gas, massive crowds of Black people demanding justice, of white Americans, allies of those people, demanding justice. But in fact, these issues have been boiling for so long. They tipped over this summer, but they've tipped over so many other times before. It was a trauma that I couldn't quite understand, but I sensed early in my initial questioning that led me to covering the Black Lives Matter movement for so many years. And it's of course a movement that's saying that Black people should simply not be killed by the police unjustly. But it's also meant that Black people deserve adequate health care, a fair shot at the criminal justice system, good paying jobs, the ability to define themselves, what equality looks like. It's also meant not only being allowed into predominantly white schools or neighborhoods or workplaces, but it's meant thriving and transforming those spaces, seeing fair resources poured into Black spaces, vulnerable spaces, rural spaces, and having the freedom to create wholly new spaces. Those same issues are at the heart of the protests that I chronicled over and over again for PBS NewsHour after the death of George Floyd, when thousands of people gathered in the streets of DC and in states across the country to demand justice. Those same fears are there when I chronicle the pandemic's disproportionate impact. They are there in the voices of people like Sierra Bates Chamberlain, a young woman I interviewed and that I met virtually, who told me that 4 members of her family were on breathing machines spread all across Chicago. There are also the stories of Ruby Quintanilla. She's an Amazon warehouse worker, also in Chicago, who fears catching the virus and spreading it to the 2 elderly parents that she's taking care of. But she's trying to make a living. Those shame issues are in so many of the stories and the scenes that we're seeing play out in the pandemic. And they're all about political access and about power. And it's also how I found myself at the White House in one of the most chaotic administrations in the history. Of course, most of you may know me from my exchanges with the president, but I wanted to tell you about my backstory so that you understood when you see me exchanging with the president or asking questions, the foundation through which I'm asking those questions. In particular, I want to point you to 2 years ago, long before the pandemic, long before the killing of George Floyd, long before this awful year. In 2018, I asked the president this. On the campaign trail, you called yourself a nationalist. Some people saw you as emboldening white nationalists. Some people see the Republican Party as supporting white nationalism because your rhetoric. What do you make of that? The president, of course, called my question racist. Since then, the virus has ravaged throughout our country. We've had several heated exchanges. And I've been getting the question more and more, a question that I'm sure maybe some of you will ask me. What does it feel like to go toe-to-toe with the president? How does it make you feel? What is it like when the president calls you nasty? My response, I'm so focused on my purpose. I'm studied and continue to be studied by the hands of my ancestors who came to the United States so that I could pose these questions that I keep on posing. And I have news for you, each and every one of you, students, faculty members, alumni, each of you will experience moments, especially during this year, where people will challenge the very premise of your existence and your pursuits. Maybe someone will tell you, like someone once told me, that you're not confident enough to do the job that you're setting out to do. Maybe someone will question your career choices or who you choose to love or where you choose to live. This year, as we look at all of the exchanges that I've had with the president, what I want you to know is that I continue to think of all the people who will never get a chance to go into the White House, who will never get a chance to question the president on what he thinks about family members who listened to his advice early in the pandemic and continue to go to work and continue to go to funerals and continue to go to indoor gatherings. I keep on thinking of all the people in this country that are suffering, that have found themselves in such harrowing conditions. They deserve a press corps, a White House correspondent in me that will not be swayed or pushed off track by anything that's going on, but instead that will be focused on my original purpose, which is telling the truth and finding those truths. So I guess in my advice, though you may not have asked me for some, I would say press forward in these intense and tough times. That's what I do. I press forward and focus on my privilege I have in making a living questioning powerful people. I press forward because I know at my core, I'm an American because someone loved me enough to risk it all. And finally, of course, November will be a critical point in our history. We are living through a moment where both Joe Biden and President Trump are making the case that this is the most important election in our history. President Trump says that if Joe Biden is elected, that the suburbs will be abolished, that police officers will not be respected, that the streets of America will be bloodstained. He's making the case that climate is not something that, climate change rather, is not something that should be focused on, that he knows what's best, that scientists should not be listened to. And I should tell you, I've talked to so many of his supporters who see themselves in the president. And while I know, obviously, some of you will not believe in his politics, there are millions of Americans who are looking at the president and think that he has their best interests in mind. And then, of course, you have Joe Biden, someone who is making the case that President Trump is dangerous, that he's someone who's simply not fit for office, that he's someone who's not decent, who's not fair. If you're a supporter of Joe Biden, you are worried about the idea that President Trump could get 4 more years to, in Democrats' terms, wreak more havoc, have less empathy. In these times, as a reporter, I find myself wondering, no matter which man wins, what will America look like in November 2020 and December 2020? We've been at PBS NewsHour have been trying to get people comfortable with the idea that we may not know the election results. But I know in my gut, I feel that we are going to be facing a tough road ahead as we look at the election results and we look at the meaning of America. I think of my friend Nicole Hannah-Jones at the New York Times, who founded the 1619 Project. And no matter who is in office, it will be up to us as Americans to be real about the founding of America, the fact that the land was stolen from Native Americans, that the buildings and much of the economic success is built on the back of enslaved people, and that our political systems have at times locked out Americans of all races and socioeconomic backgrounds, but especially, of course, vulnerable Americans who may not get a chance to voice their opinions in the same way that wealthy Americans in privileged settings and of all kinds will be able to voice their opinions. So as I think about being the Robert C. Wood professor, what I think about is the idea that we are facing times where people are worried. And journalism, more than ever, should be the place where people can at least find education, if not comfort. in each of my stories that I've been telling this year, in all of our stories at PBS NewsHour, we've been setting out to put viewers in the homes, in the living rooms of other Americans. Because one of the things that I've learned is that ignorance often leads to fear. And we are obviously facing a fear election, an election that's not only about the pandemic, but an election that's also about people's well-beings, how they feel they can move throughout the world. President Trump and both Vice President Joe Biden have cast this election in dire terms, in terms that will follow us after 2020, into 2021, into 2022. No times have been more dire in my lifetime than these times. And as a reporter, I'm bracing for it. I'm ready to chronicle the outcome. I think academics will have so much of a role to play in how these times are studied, how history reflects in who is right and who is wrong. But in my telling of 2020, the thing that I'm constantly thinking about is my legacy and how history will judge the journalism and the academics and the politics of these times. Each day that I wake up, I think about how my mother and how my grandmother would want their stories told, would want the story of America told. And we owe it to so many other Americans who are struggling to get this right. So in my journalism, I hope that you will have seen someone who is being a proper representative for America, not focusing on myself, not focusing on whatever heated exchanges you might know me for, but who's focusing on making sure that America sees its flaws and rectifies those flaws going forward. Thank you.
Wow. If we were live now in person, there would be a standing ovation of the hundreds of people that are in this room right now, and it would be going on and on and on. So inspiring and so powerful, and really appreciate you speaking about your truths and your history, and that puts you in a context that I don't think many of us have known. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
We're delighted that you are willing to answer questions. We have lots of questions. By the way, I will say, I'm clearly not the only one who's inspired by you. The chat is buzzing with people who are putting their thoughts down about the strength and inspiration that you bring to them. So thank you very, very much for that. And thank you for uplifting our community.
Thank you.
We're delighted to have a variety of folks who are going to start the questioning. We're going to have question and answer for the next 45 minutes or so. I think, as you know, Robert Wood's daughter is now the senator from our neighbor up north, New Hampshire, Maggie Hassan. And I will also welcome his widow, Franny is here as well. And I'm sorry, widow Peggy is here, and daughter Franny is here as well. They are very involved in the Wood Committee that chooses the lectureship and helps plan. So thank you, Peggy and Franny, for being here. And I do believe that Senator Hassan is on right now. And so if we can open it up for the first question, we'd be delighted. Senator Hassan, who has spent her life in public service like her father, most recently as governor of New Hampshire, but prior to that was in the state legislature, and has devoted her life to social justice and equity and making sure that regular people can get health care and have jobs and have education. And it's a pleasure to have her here today joining us. So if we can make the technology work, we'd love to hear from the senator.
Oh, thank you, Dean Cash. I am so grateful for that introduction. And to Ms. Alcindor, thank you for your remarks and accepting this role as the Robert C. Wood visiting professor. I caught the very end of your remarks, and they were indeed inspiring. And I'll echo what the dean was just saying in terms of the chat room is blowing up right now with comments from folks. Thank you too for your very kind words about my dad. And to the dean's point, my mom, Peggy, is in this Zoom room, as is my sister, Franny, and I think my brother, Frank, may be too. We are all very proud to have you in this role, grateful for your nice words about Dad. And you are right, he relished his own kind of good trouble and would be very honored by you associating that phrase with him. And lastly, before my question, I just want to say, I, for one, and I think I'm joined with everybody in the Zoom room and millions of Americans, are very, very glad you are where you are and that you have the opportunity to go toe to toe with this president, as we are very glad that a diverse and strong press corps all across our country has the chance to go toe to toe with its elected leaders, its public servants, and particularly go toe to toe with any president of the United States of America. So thank you for being such a phenomenal professional at this very critical time. I want to just drill down a little bit on what that role can mean to Americans, because obviously our country is facing numerous crises right now, including a public health crisis with COVID-19, the resulting economic crisis that it has created, and a crisis of racial injustice. We are also a deeply divided nation, and I believe that having a common understanding of the facts and the truth can play a key role in helping us come to a common understanding and build bridges. Could you speak to the role that you think journalism and reporting the truths plays in helping Americans to overcome the crises that we are currently facing and the divisions in our country? You touched on it some, but I'd love for you to expand on it a little bit. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that question. I'm sure your father would be so proud of you and all that you've accomplished. And hello to all of your family. I'm, again, so honored to be able to be here and to be part of your father's legacy as part of this visiting professorship. I think the role of journalism is more critical than ever. I think when I got into journalism, as I said, I was really focused on the civil rights movement. But if I'm honest, I was thinking that what I would be chronicling wouldn't be life and death anymore. It would be a sort of higher thing going on. Maybe it would be pay equity, or it would be access to education, or it would be access to Wall Street. But what I've found is that we're still dealing with life and death in America. And the ability for Americans to even survive, let alone thrive, is at hand in these days as we look at 2020. So I think the role of journalism has to be a role of service. I was a longtime print reporter. I remember never wanting to be on TV because I thought, well, TV is too showy. I don't want to be someone who's a personality. And what I realized is, of course, now being a television reporter, how critical it can also be to use the medium of TV to show people what's happening, to go into people's homes, to have cameras into people's lives. So I think that when I think about the role that I'm playing, it's so much about service and so little about kind of going in and getting personal with anybody, including, of course, the president, but also I had a long time covering Bernie Sanders in 2016 when he at times did not like my questions. So I think that what journalism should be is posing those tough questions and being brave. I remember being a young reporter and at times literally shaking because I was worried about the question that I was going to be asking the certain politicians and that they were going to get mad at me. But I have to always implore journalists, especially young journalists, to go forward and be brave as we all possibly can be. I think in all of our endeavors, whether you're a senator or a congresswoman or a professor or a healthcare provider, doing what's right in this moment is what is going to be critical to America surviving and thriving. And I think journalism is at the heart of that. And is, of course, as I said, my calling. So I think journalism has to be not just being objective. We've been having a lot of conversations, especially in the media, about the idea of objectivity. I'm for being fair and honest. And that means not just being not being part of a false equivalency. For example, climate change. I did a fellowship in Germany, and there was a person who asked me, why do Americans, this was several years ago, maybe almost a decade ago, why do Americans cover climate change as if it's a debate? We know that scientists, the majority of scientists know that the climate is changing. Why cover it as a debate? So I think we've moved on from there. We haven't been doing that as much anymore, but I think that's just one way that we can say, look, the president is not just not believing in climate change. He's not acknowledging climate change, because it's not whether or not you believe in climate change, is clearly happening. So I think that that's the role of journalism. And again, thanks for the question.
Well, thank you so much. Godspeed and be safe. And thanks again, everybody, for including me.
Thank you so much, Senator. It's always wonderful to have you as part of these events, and it's, of course, wonderful to have the rest of the family here as well. We're going to go on to our next question from one of our students, but for those of you who do want to ask questions from the audience, you can either do it by raising your virtual hand. You do that by clicking down in the participants section at the bottom of your screen, or you can send it to the chat. We'll try to get as many questions as we can. This next question is from Denise Moreau. She's a doctoral candidate in our Global Governance and Human Security program and a teaching fellow with the Center for Women in Politics and Public Policy. Denise?
Thanks so much for joining us today, Ms. Alcindor, and thank you for your inspiring and insightful words. My question for you is, as a woman of color and a journalist who has been committed to social justice, what does speaking truth to power mean to you? And in speaking truth to power, what is the importance of covering issues like race and inequality in the United States, in addition to what some might consider to be those more hard politics issues of economics and foreign policy?
Well, I think about that question is a great question. Thanks for asking it. That question makes me think of my favorite Ta-Nehisi Coates quote. I won't quote it exactly, but essentially what he wrote in the Atlantic several years ago is that there are journalists who think that covering race is just as important as covering the Middle East or Tokyo or any sort of other topics that are seen as kind of mainstream topics. I think we're now realizing how incredibly important it is to cover race, and race is, I say that because speaking truth to power to me will always include race. It will always include looking directly at some of the original sins of America, and that of course being slavery and how we acquired the land on which we all live. So I think speaking truth to power is about acknowledging just the limitations of the principles and ideals that this country was founded on. And also, it means not just fact-checking the president, because of course there's a lot of fact-checking that goes on. All the fact-checkers in America have been so busy for the last 4 years. But I also think a fact-check needs to be actually showing. So one of the things I did soon after the death of George Floyd, I went out to the protests in front of the White House to interview people, to talk to Americans, to ask them why in the middle of a pandemic would you take the physical risk of going to a protest. And what that was really showing this is not Antifa. This is not some domestic terrorist group that's filled with people who are actors. These are real Americans who are mothers, who are daughters, who are white, who are Black, who are Latino, who are Native American, who are saying things need to change, including access to healthcare, but also so many other things like policing. So I think it really is about using your God-given talents, being a Catholic, I should say, using your God-given talents to better the world, and in a way that sometimes might make people uncomfortable, but in a way that allows you to be able to be on the right side of history.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Denise, for the question. Our next question is from Professor Michael Johnson. Professor Johnson is the chair of the Public Policy and Public Affairs Department, and Michael, I hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, David. And thank you, Ms. Alcindor, for your thoughtful and powerful remarks. I found your words so inspirational. Thank you. Thank you very much. In recent months, ideas that would have seemed far-fetched or useful primarily for rhetorical purposes, such as abolishing or defunding the police, have transformed into viable policy initiatives. Of course, Minneapolis is one example of this. What do you make of other seemingly radical notions that have been offered in the mainstream media, such as dissolving the Republican Party if it is defeated at the polls, because in its current form it offers no useful opportunities for political engagement? How should the press cover these and other progressive ideas that you may see entering the popular discourse?
I guess, could you repeat part of that question?
Yeah, how do you think the press should cover ideas that may seem radical, but which have the potential to quickly enter the public discourse? 6 months ago, defunding the police was just a notion. Now it's not.
I think we should cover them by covering them. I mean, I think that we should be educating people on the things that are on people's minds and the solutions that are being presented. The idea of defunding the police is a good example of that. I think that there are obviously some people who look at defunding the police and see it as abolishing the police completely and are pushing for that. There are also people that take the term defunding the police, and what they mean is disinvesting some money from the police or holding back money and putting more money into social work or mental health. Some people mean that it means keeping the police at maybe its current funding levels while also increasing funding for schools and education and housing. So I think what we have to do is not be worried about looking at ideas as far-fetched. I think there are times maybe when people look to the media as being a filter, and we are in some ways, of course, a filter. We choose our stories, we choose who we want to interview, we choose the topics that we pick. But I think we should be willing and open to talk to people of all generations about their ideas.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Johnson. I have a related question here that came from Thomas Champion, who starts with, your body of work speaks for itself. Your professionalism, courage, and persistence are fortunately matters of permanent record. But one of the biggest problems we face in our deeply divided nation is that a large portion of the general public simply does not hear and will not accept the reporting of you and other responsible journalists. Is there a way to break through the bubble or silo that allows so many Americans to insist on alternative facts that aren't actually facts at all?
I have to say, I'm not overly worried about kind of convincing people that the reporting that we're doing is accurate and fact-based, because I really feel like the reporting has to speak for itself. I don't consider my role as a journalist convincing people that what I'm telling them is true. I think we are living, of course, in an increasingly polarized society. So people in some ways are going to be looking at my work through all sorts of lenses, making all sorts of assumptions, both about myself personally, but also PBS and the media as a whole.
Mm-hmm. Well, here's a kind of related question that comes from Bob Turner. Thank you, Bob. Bob is the chair of the Wood Committee that makes this all happen. So I just wanted to give a shout out to Bob for that. Does today's journalism do more to divide us or unite us?
I think that we're living in a polarized society where if you're someone who is a fan of President Trump, you have a certain network or a certain group of journalists that you like. And maybe if you're a critic of President Trump, you are looking at a certain network and a certain journalist that you like. But I don't know if journalism is per se the reason why America is more divided as much as it's our lived experiences. People are living in segregated communities. The wealth gap is so wide and continues to widen. Think of all sorts of everyday activities that are at times real struggles for people. So I'm thinking of Black women having a baby, the mortality rates among African-American women versus white women. Then you have rural communities where white Americans who maybe feel like at times that the country is saying that you have so much privilege and that you should be able to thrive no matter what, that there are white Americans who have told me, I live in a rural community where there's no broadband. So I think that what's dividing Americans a lot of the time is their own ability not to fully access the American dream. And they're seeing, of course, at times that reality through media, but I think it really is a personal experience. And I should say there also is the ideals that we're born with and that we culturally have. I will just put it out there that there are some people who are frankly just racist. So I think that there are times where people will look at me and see my reporting, and before I even open my mouth, they are judging and assuming things about me that I can't help. So I think that all of that is, I think, part of how and why our country is so divided.
Mm-hmm. Good. Okay. This is again somewhat related question. These are great. These questions are coming that kind of link to one another. This question, and it comes back to your point about sort of your job is to seek the truth, expose the truth. Why did it take so long? And this is from Susan Tellingator. Why did it take so long for journalists to state the president was not telling the truth, i.e. lying? And I do recall during that time, there were lots of articles about different media outlets deciding to use terms like lying or not telling the truth or misstatements, et cetera. But how do you think about that?
So I should say that I worked at the New York Times in 2016, and pretty quickly we were saying what the president's saying isn't true, what the president's lying. I think there was a discussion of whether or not the word lie should be used, for sure. But even without using that word at the beginning, journalists were pointing out, well, that definitely wasn't true. That was a misstatement. That was misleading. And there have always been fact checkers essentially saying this politician is not saying this. Fact checkers, of course, existed long before President Trump came into office because, frankly, he is not the first political leader to not tell the truth. So I think that in some ways, people maybe wanted to see the word lie be used quicker. But I can't purport to speak for the entire media of why some outlets took longer, but I can say for sure that at my outlet, at the New York Times, the word lie was used within a matter of months, and if not a matter of weeks.
Was there conversation within the staff, the editorial, the reporters, journalists, like when you use lie, when you use misstatement? I'm curious about that.
Not quite. I mean, I think for me, it's always been about trying to be as clear as possible. So I probably wasn't in the room when the bigger decisions were being made on what we put in our headlines, but I can say as a reporter, I was always taught to explain things kind of on a really bare bones level, and explain things like I would explain something if I called my mom up and said it. So if someone told me something that was not true, oftentimes I wouldn't say, oh, that person told me an untruth. I would say, oh yeah, that person lied to me today. So I think that that's always been where I've been coming from.
Got it. Great, thank you. You had mentioned in that last answer kind of differences maybe between different outlets. So here's a question from Associate Dean Edozie, Professor Edozie. Make sure she's unmuted.
Okay. Hi again, Yamiche. Great answers, great conversation. I see that you work for PBS on the one hand, and you consult with MSNBC and sometimes maybe CNN. I wondered if you found that there was a comparison between the PBS standard, with the commercial, sort of 24-hour ideological news cycle that comes out of, Fox News, MSNBC, CNN. Do you think that there is a difference between the two? How do you sort of reconcile working, with both? And do you think that MSNBC is the lefty version of Fox News or not?
So in my mind, the organizations that I work for really aren't that different, PBS versus MSNBC. Maybe from a viewer's perspective, it might be different, but from the working journalist perspective, every single time I'm on TV, I'm saying things that are accurate. I'm seeking to report the truth. I'm seeking to explain. The journalists that I know that work at NBC and MSNBC, they're seeking to do the same thing as the ones at PBS NewsHour. Obviously, PBS NewsHour is 1 hour a day of news. It's a kind of traditional nightly newscast where MSNBC and CNN are 24-hour news stations. So of course they have just more time to report, more people to have, more guests to have, more debates to be able to be had. But I think that the level of journalism is on par. The standards are high. When they make a mistake, they say they made a mistake. When they employ someone, they try to find someone who is equipped to be able to do the story. When a story is happening, they want to be on the scene to tell that story. I will also say, I know that there are probably some people who are also wondering about Fox News. I've never worked for Fox News, but I know a lot of the journalists that cover the White House for Fox News. I'm thinking of the White House correspondents that I work with. A lot of them have also set out to really push the president on issues and to really also report on the news. I think there are, of course, news personalities and opinion hosts on networks, but I think when I look at straight reporting, people who do what I do across the board, I find that we have a shared goal of trying to get to the bottom of what's going on.
Thank you.
Thanks. We have a question from an alum of our program, Esther Rogers. Esther, you had a question. If you can unmute, love to hear it.
Good morning, everyone. How's everyone doing this morning? I want to say thank you so much for coming and speaking with us. I was really inspired by your background and also your, taking on these political extremes in our nation today. My question for you would be to, I'd like to have your insights. I worked in the homeless population, substance abuse population for, over a number of years. And I was wondering, what is your insight about the lack of awareness of the impact on COVID-19 on this population?
I mean, I think that, I guess the question is, what's my insight on it? I mean, I think I know as someone who was just out in Southeast Washington, D.C., doing a story about vulnerable populations that are being impacted by COVID-19, that journalists are, I think, really scrambling to kind of get our arms around how many people in which vulnerable populations are being impacted. I've definitely seen stories about homeless shelters and outbreaks. So I think people are doing their best to try to report that. But I think, of course, more reporting and more time needs to be paid to all sorts of issues, including, of course, the homeless population.
Right, because I know that in the beginning, there was very little awareness because everyone was worried about the lockdowns, how it's going to affect the economy, people, losing their jobs. And this population was not, brought forward in the conversations about how we can actually help. I know here in Massachusetts, Marty Walsh had the convention center converted into a somewhat of a shelter for people from a homeless population who was impacted or infected, but like I said, it just wasn't there until later on, several months after March. And I was concerned about that because, like I said, I worked in this population for a number of years, and I know about the difficulties that they actually face in the shelter with overcrowding. You're not able to social distance. And I was wondering, in the beginning, the lack of awareness, why it wasn't there.
I mean, I think we were, of course, facing an unprecedented pandemic. So everyone was scrambling to get their minds around what was going on. I should say, I know of someone like Nikita Stewart, who covers social justice and poor populations at the New York Times. There are people whose full-time jobs are to look at homelessness. So in some ways, I know that obviously it can be at times maybe not the top of every single newscast, but I want to say that I've at least seen some of the colleagues that I know at the Washington Post and the New York Times doing phenomenal work on homeless populations in the pandemic. And they've been doing that work, I wouldn't say pretty early on, because again, they were really focused. I even know of a friend in March who was doing a story about homeless veterans who were pooling their stimulus checks together to try to figure out how to weather the pandemic. So I think there was some of that reporting, but I agree with that there might be times where that reporting maybe isn't as visible because we're dealing with so much other stuff.
Thank you, Esther. Great question, and thank you, Yamiche, for that. We have a question from another professor at McCormack, Professor Maria Ivanova. It's a professor in the Conflict Resolution, Human Security, and Global Governance Department. Maria.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Ms. Alcindor, for being with us today as the Robert C. Wood professor here. I bring greetings from Christiana Figueres, who was the previous Robert C. Wood professor and who was the first one to do this discussion online. We just chatted with Christiana, and I mentioned to her that you raised the issue of climate change, and so she sends her greetings directly to you, literally in real time. And I'm truly delighted that we're able to do this and open the room where it happens virtually to anyone. And I was very encouraged and excited by you raising the issue of climate change and the fact that it is no longer, it is not a debate. And as a journalist, what is the role? No, what is the responsibility of journalists to engage with climate change and urge a collective response to it in this new reality with so many other issues that are pressing for attention?
I think the responsibility is great. I think that as journalists, we need to be chronicling what some national security experts say is the biggest national security threat to America, that being climate change. Jay Johnson, the former Secretary of Homeland Security, said that just this week, that he sees climate change as the biggest threat. We obviously see the fires in Oregon and California killing people, decimating whole communities. I think it's been encouraging to see so many news organizations dedicate reporters to the issue of climate change. Having been at the New York Times, I'm very familiar that they have a pretty robust climate change and environmental team that is writing stories every day about this.
Great.
I hope we hear more.
Thank you. Here's a question from Celia, Celia L. How much does Trump's Twitter posts wag the media dog? Is his complete Twitter log going to be archived for history or research? First part of that question. Yeah, that we don't know. But how much do you think his Twitter wags the media dog?
Wags the media dog?
Yeah, I think maybe here's a way. Maybe we can, Celia, if you want to jump in here to clarify. I think what this means is people often talk about what he's doing is kind of distracting from other things, or he sends the he sends the media.
Basically, how much is his Twitter a distraction?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yeah.
Yeah,
I hope we did that justice, Celia.
Yeah, I mean, I think his Twitter account is where U.S. policy is being made, and where foreign relations are being had, and where news is happening. I think that the media can walk and chew gum, so we can write about the asylum cases in Mexico, and people and immigration changes, and environmental regulations being rolled back, and the pandemic, while also writing about the fact that the president is encouraging Americans to vote more than once, and the president is questioning whether or not states should be allowed to vote in large numbers by mail. I think all of those things should be covered. I think his Twitter account, as much as it might feel like a distraction sometimes, it is absolutely where the president is thinking and where he's making policy. I'm thinking about the transgender military ban. That's a huge, important issue that happened on Twitter. And that's just one of so many others. So I have an Apple Watch that buzzes every time the president tweets, and I read the tweets, so maybe a lot of you don't have to, and then I can report to you the most important ones. But there are such important things happening on social media, and I think we can't ignore it.
Yeah. Great. Here's a flip of that question. There was a question, I'm not quite sure if I'm going to paraphrase it correctly, because you say the importance of social media. What kind of role should social media be playing vis-a-vis the more traditional media outlets, like the ones that you've been employed by? How do you think about social media in terms of its role as media?
I think they're all working in accordance. I think reporters that work at traditional media organizations are leaning on social media to break news, to report the news, to talk about the news, and also vice versa. Social media is helping disseminate my stories and other people's stories. I will never forget Ferguson, Missouri, when a lot of the news were really citizen journalists that were writing about the issues that were happening on the ground before traditional journalists got to Ferguson, Missouri. A lot of the first information that had to be maybe double checked, but that were at times often very accurate, that was happening on social media. So I think social media is a critical part, but I also think it's not a substitute for going into people's homes, for going out into the country, for talking to people. It's a very small subgroup of people who have enough internet and enough time to go on Twitter and have the privilege to be able to do that. There are a lot of people, construction workers who are out all day, who have political opinions, and people who live in rural areas that don't have broadband, and people who are elderly and maybe don't have access to social media, people who just frankly don't want to be part of social media, that are millennials who don't trust it because of all the issues that we've seen go on in the last election. All of those people still deserve to have their opinions, their thoughts, their feelings covered. So I think we can't lean on it too much, but it's definitely a critical part of journalism.
Great, thank you. We have a question from Maria Rogers. So if Maria can be unmuted, let's hear it.
Hello, Yamiche and my fellow soror.
Okay.
My question to you, and I often think about this a lot, is do you think there is too much time covering Trump and the culture of fear that the media pushes out? And do you feel there should be more coverage of Biden and the solutions to what is happening to our nation? And do you feel that we need more hope? Because I feel that every time Trump tweets something or distracts, the media is following down that rabbit hole and that we're constantly getting bombarded. But yet there is not enough time offering solutions and hope so that the country can see alternatives to what this misinformation campaign is Trump is pushing out.
I think part of the upper hand, if that's one way to put it, of being an incumbent president is that you get to use the presidency as part of getting attention during an election year. It's why incumbents have, why it's hard to beat incumbents in, I would say, in almost any position, but definitely in the presidency. It's why you see it in the Senate, in the House, in local council meetings, school boards. Being the incumbent means that you can make news on the actual beat through policy changes and through other things, while also, of course, then making news campaigning. I know that a lot of people talk about, of course, the president using the White House in some remarkable ways, thinking about when he had that, what a lot of people thought was that dangerous gathering for the Republican National Convention, but that was newsy and needed to be covered. So I think that in some ways, we're seeing the coverage of President Trump equal the idea of what it means to be an incumbent president. When Obama was being challenged, he got a lot of the attention because he was, again, the person in the job currently. And when I think about Joe Biden's being covered a lot. A lot of the networks take his remarks live. A lot of the networks, they have reporters living in Delaware on the bus with him when he travels to be able to understand what's going on there. Senator Harris, much like Mike Pence, they're being covered when they're traveling and going places. So I think it is true that there is an imbalance of attention, but it's largely also because the president is the president. So he can make news in the White House while also then going out and doing a campaign rally. Also, frankly, he's doing things that Joe Biden isn't doing, which is that he's holding these massive rallies, a lot of them that health officials say are not the right thing to do, but he's having these massive events that reporters are covering. And I think that's why you're seeing Joe Biden start to come out more, start to go to different stops and start to kind of be seen a bit more because he understands that he is dealing with an opponent that's going to get a lot of attention because he's president, and also because he's willing to do some really outlandish things.
Thank you, Maria. Here's a related question, because I know that Maria asked about hope. Terry Burks has a question. In addition to the media covering the current environment, which in my opinion is negative because there are a lot of facts that you're encountering that are negative right now, can you see any sign of hope that the American people can lean on?
Yes, I mean, in my remarks, and I should say I apologize for always looking down my phone, but when you cover President Trump, you're constantly terrified that like something crazy is going to happen. So that's me texting my producer saying, is anything happening? But I think there are signs of hope because when I in my remarks, I talked about the fact that 2020 for being awful, for being terrible, is also, I think, a year where we're seeing people have these conversations that we just maybe never imagined having. My friend, Nicole Hannah-Jones at the New York Times, I talk to her a lot and I say, I can't believe we're rethinking the founding year of America. Would anybody have ever imagined that 1619 would be the year that we would constantly be thinking about for the founding of America? 1776 was burned into everyone's memory. And now Nicole comes out and 1619 is on everyone's memory. So I think that I'm profoundly hopeful that we're able to stare dead in the face some of the issues that we're dealing with. It's sad how we got here. I would have, of course, wanted it not to be with millions of Americans infected with a scary virus, but we're here and we're having these conversations. I also think in workplaces all over, not just in media, but academia, education, we're wondering, what does diversity look like? What does diversity mean? And how are people how are people treating each other? I think of the idea of unconscious bias. As someone who's covered race for a long time, I think we as reporters and as people who have been in this space as activists or academics, we talk about unconscious bias and we know the statistics by heart. But I think a lot of Americans are learning for the first time what inequality actually looks like. And I think for that, I'm hopeful. And I think I'm hopeful because the next generation, even though I know of probably a lot of people are looking at me saying, aren't you the next generation? I think there's a generation coming behind me that is incredibly smart, that is incredibly inspiring, that really gets the work that needs to happen. And I'm so excited to help those Gen Zers or whatever the next generation is called. You know, there's a whole generation that's learning about virtual learning, and that's also learning about the inequality of virtual learning, that that understand that some of their classmates are being left behind because their parents can't afford to be in a special pod, or that their parents can't afford to watch them all day or work from home, because so many people can't work from home, right? Social distancing in and of itself is a privilege. I think all of that those conversations are things that I feel like give me hope for the next, for the future.
Great, that's wonderful. Here's a question that's somewhat related to those big questions of race in our history. I was really struck when you were talking about your own history, and you said, I believe it was when you were a teenager, and you were wondering who in the world is in charge of all these decisions. And I think you were meaning the decisions that barricaded people of color out from opportunity and a whole range of other decisions like that. How would you answer that question now? If you could answer your 15-year-old self, who in the world is in charge of all these decisions, how would you even think about that?
It's so hard because I thought those are simple questions, as I said, and they're such complex questions, right? They're such hard questions. Who is making the decision to segregate America? Who's making the decisions to create barriers so that a lot of AP classes don't have the diversity? And who's making the question that the media, last time I checked, is something like 3% African American? I don't know. I think that there are stakeholders, there are politicians, there are gerrymandering, there are people, there are school boards that are making decisions, healthcare professionals that are deciding when an African American mother should be believed when she says that she can't wait any longer for a C-section and when they can't. But it's so complex that there are a multitude of people making those decisions. I will say that most of them are people that at times can hide behind shadows and cannot be seen as making those decisions. And I think that's the scary thing, but that's also the thing that makes reporting to me still exciting, because I'm still trying to answer I'm still trying to answer that question in a real way. Because I think a lot of the inequalities, I mean, of course, there are people that lash out at President Trump and talk about his rhetoric. He's used racist terms. He's changed the immigration systems. But we can, if we're honest with ourselves, America and inequalities existed so much longer than before President Trump was even born. So I think that that is, I think, the scary part of all of this. That even if you're someone who maybe doesn't support President Trump, in 4 years or in 8 years or whenever, when he's out of office, it's not going to snap, and people aren't going to just stop being killed by the police because President Trump is gone. Ferguson happened under President Obama. So I think there are so many big decisions that are being made by people that we can't often put a name to.
Well, here's a related question that makes it very concrete from Michelle Ballard. She writes, well, what can we do to ensure that more women of color have an opportunity to pursue a career in journalism with an emphasis on politics?
I think it's about mentorship, and it's about support and resources. When I think about when I became a journalist, I think about the fact that I was able to go to a school that I went to Georgetown. I went on a full ride for the most part. I think if I wasn't able to get the help that I got to even go to Georgetown, that I wouldn't be sitting before you today. If I wasn't someone who could have afforded to go to internships that maybe didn't pay me that much, but that could be supplemented by my parents, I would not have been able to become a journalist. I think of the fact that going into all sorts of industries, journalism, publishing, academia, it's often that you're not making a living wage for the first few years. I talk about Nicole a lot because we have a lot in common, but Nicole Hannah-Jones, she often reminds me that she worked at a mattress store while also being a journalist in the beginning of her career, because journalism just couldn't pay the bills. I know so many people. I have another friend who worked at a restaurant while being a journalist because it just simply didn't pay the bills. So I think that a lot of the barriers are economic barriers that we have to really think through. I know a lot of my friends that are education reporters. Access to quality schools is so critical to just development. And I it makes me so sad. I know we were talking about hope, but it makes me so sad to think about how many kids are going to be behind in school because their parents don't have the means to supplement what they need in these times, and that they're going to fall behind maybe a year, maybe 2 years in school because of all that's going on. And it makes me sad, but I think that we have to figure out the solutions to these things.
Great. Well, we're coming at the, unfortunately, at the end of our time, because I know we could go on and on and on. And it's been so fascinating, but I want to give you a few minutes to close. You've heard the kinds of questions that our community asks and is interested in. You've heard the inspiration that you bring to them, which is a real gift that you're doing. So you take another minute or so to kind of summarize, wrap up, or tell us whatever you want to leave us with.
Well, I want to again say thank you so much for this opportunity to come before you to speak in the legacy of Robert Wood. I want to thank his family, if you're still on, for sharing him with the world and all of the work that he was able to do and the leadership roles that he was able to hold. And I want to also implore people. I know that a lot of the questions were about journalism, but each of us, I think, has a role to play. No matter your politics, Democrat, Republican, Independent, each of us has a role to play on people being fairly treated in America. And I challenge people, while you're watching the news and while you're reading stories, if you see something that you don't like, then change it. If you are looking at this and thinking that's not right, figure out a way to use your skills to impact that. I said journalism is my good trouble. I think everyone has their good trouble. I think the worst thing we can do in 2020 especially, and it's hard to do, but is to be depressed and to be stuck in our ways and to be sitting on our couches not doing the work. I know it's exhausting. For me personally, I know I've had times where I've struggled, to be frankly honest, this year. But I think that we can't let sadness and the atmosphere of mourning and grief be all that we think of this year. This, I think, is a major lesson on looking at the world and figuring out where you can make an impact. So I hope that my journalism makes an impact, and I hope that you'll keep watching and reading. But I also hope that you'll keep also giving us ideas. I was thinking about the question on homelessness. If you see something that's not being covered fairly, tweet me, DM me, talk to your favorite reporter if it's a local story. I think that we as a society have a responsibility to not just wait for people to cover things, but to also go out and say, we all need to turn to this issue. So I hope that you all took something away from my talk and my answers to your questions. And I really, really appreciate being here.
Oh, well, we did. We absolutely did. And you could see it from the chats, how much people have gotten out of your time with us and your sharing with us and the appreciation. I'm just seeing a lot of capital letters and exclamation points go by. So people are very inspired and very energized what you have to say. So thank you so much, Yamiche, for what you have offered and given to our community. With that, thank you. I also want to thank the folks who've been responsible for making this happen. Rochelle Straker is our events director at McCormack, and she pulled this all together with Jack Lee. Bob Turner is on the Wood Committee, and he's part of the team that identifies and invites people. There are others who are on the Wood Committee here as well, Associate Dean Adozi, who you've met. And I just want to thank the other members of the team and thank everybody in the audience. You've been a fantastic audience. The questions have been phenomenal. The appreciation and gratitude for Yamiche has been fantastic. And I just want to thank everybody. This was a fantastic day, a fantastic Wood lecture. And thanks to the Wood family As you could tell from what so many people said, you have left quite a legacy and you're continuing to work on that legacy for social justice and information that can help us change the world. So thank you very much, everybody, and have a wonderful day.
Thanks.